Thank you so much for coming to the St. Genevieve Museum Learning Center. We have our speaker series tonight that we'll get to in just a moment, a little housekeeping. If you need to use the restroom, just go 15 feet down that hallway, hang a left, you're there. Pretty easy. How many of you paid for admittance tonight? See, you guys need to become a member.
Very good.
If you become a member, all of our speaker series are free. You can come in anytime you want. Free, unlimited visits to the museum as well. And if you'd like to apply tonight's admittance to your membership, you're welcome to do that. Just go down to the gift shop after the show, and you can apply that to a membership. So we'd love to have you be a member and supporter of our museum here. We are totally not-for-profit, 501c3, so we rely on a few grants here and there, the admitting to the museum, and donations, of course, and sponsorships. So we certainly appreciate all of that.
That was what? Don't what?
What?
Don't what?
Don't what?
Donations. Is that a word?
It's a word.
Repeat it.
Robert loses sleep a lot for that. But anyway, now I lost my train of thought. Way to go. Way to go. We have a speaker series tonight. We try and have a couple a month. Our next one coming up is toward the end of the month, and it's a fascinating one on the Black Fathom Cave with Chet McCain. And he's done this presentation for us before, last fall or better, and fascinating stuff, the world down under. So if you're into caving, don't call it spelunking. It's not called spelunking anymore. He's a caver. So get that straight. So that'll be a fascinating presentation too. So again, your membership applies to any speaker presentation. You get in free and apply your membership, your admittance that you paid tonight. We have Fossil Day coming up. That's always fun. If you have some fascinating find in your backyard, you think, I know this is a dinosaur bone, I'm going to find out. Well, just come and bring it on Fossil Day, and they'll tell you if you have a real find or if you have a false find. So anyway, so let's get going with tonight's presentation. We are so happy to have with us Miss Emily Lyons, a great historian on Kaskaskia. How many of you were one of her students?
First year on the island.
First year on the island. Good for you.
First year teaching on the island. It was her first year teaching.
Well, very good. How about that? That's neat. I don't think there's anyone who knows more about Kaskaskia Island than yourself.
Oh, they won't admit it.
I know. When we have friends that come and we, drive up and down 61 and what have you, and go past the road to Kaskaskia, we say, now Kaskaskia is part of Missouri, or part of Illinois, right? And they say, what? And they, it's a whole big story. You ought to find out sometime. So you're going to learn a lot more tidbits tonight. So our presentation tonight is sponsored by Country Mart in St. Genevieve. So if you drop by Country Mart, be sure to thank them for the fine sponsorship. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Miss Emily Lyons.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you all for coming. I don't know about in the back if you can hear me or not, but I'll do the best I can on that. I was just wandering through all these wonderful exhibits and everything. I'm not sure, I may have forgotten everything I came to talk about, but because this is a real education to go through all those exhibits. So that's wonderful. And I did put this up there first, which is a map of Kaskaskia, which is pretty much the modern day map, but it will show. And we're kind of the little thumbprint out here from the rest of Illinois. And so we show up on all of the state maps, you see a little bump there, okay, it's there on it. The road, this one also shows the road, I don't know if you can see this dotted.
This one?
No, that one is George Rogers Clark Track to Vincennes. But this one here that goes straight up, that
Prairie Roach?
Yeah, and that one went right up before the river decided to change its way, and it went straight on up to there. Yeah, and more maps on that. How many of you are already familiar with this on it? kinda, huh? Okay, and so you would have to look at it to see. You would have to actually get closer to really see all the roads that are marked. This pretty color over here shows you St. Genevieve and St. Mary's, where 61 comes in there and goes right on up, and how you can go H Road and then 51 to get to the Chester Bridge. The new Chester Bridge moving right along. It will come up over the levee when it's finished, so that levee doesn't need to close the gates and shut off transportation between Chester and 51 leading to Parable or anywhere else. Okay. And Fort Deschart and Prairie de Roche are up in here. Okay. Enough. Just to give you an idea of where you are. You can see where St. Genevieve, but this was not the original St. Genevieve. Where you are now, did you all know that? If you go, it was real. Well, I can tell you something that you do know. You know where Lloyd's place was before they sold to, is it Gateway? And that road goes out across the field. You go part way out there, and you would come to where the original St. Genevieve town was. And what was it called then? Anyone know that? Yes. The Old Misery, they would say. That's Old Misery because it was down out in there, and it wasn't very, very big on there, but they kept, but they would cross back and forth, and I always said, these people came across the ocean in what we would consider almost flimsy boats now, on their sailing boats, and come all the way across the ocean over to here, just crossing these rivers and going around where nothing, you know, they just struck out on it. All right, just to, so, and then they moved, and there was a flood came along, and they decided to move St. Genevieve up a little higher, up to where it is now. And now you're between two creeks. So sometimes you get a little flooding anyway, but on it. Oh, okay, now, and I hope you didn't. Okay, if you open this, but now just open it that much, just that much. Okay. Don't open it all the way, just open it up that much. All right, because it's going to be easier for you to see it on here than anything up here. Over here on the right, you see that big strip? That's the peninsula. Down at the bottom, you'll see where the Mississippi and then the Kaskaskia River comes into it, and that is just above where the Chester Bridge is now. Is where that, from the Chester Bridge, if you dare to stop, you can see that entryway there, and you can tell by all the trees that are lined up there. And then the original, you can see it was a peninsula and several miles wide there. Down towards the bottom, it'll show you the Kaskaskia village and the old fort, which was Fort Kaskaskia up on the bluff. Now keep that thought. And then shows where that old windmill is. If you're a bicycle rider and you've ever ridden from St. Genevieve over to Prairie de Roche to get out to the rendezvous, you went past that old mill. It was along there on that, was it Fishback Road? Fish something road along there. And that would take you a kind of a shortcut to Prairie de Roche rather than go in to Modoc and on up the Bluff Road. Okay, it shows you an Indian village up here. No, that's the one up by Fort Deschart. There was another, the one just where it says Kaskaskia Village, and then it says Indian. Of course, when the Indians with all the Jesuits moved the church down from the Illinois River site where it was because Chief Rowenzza didn't want to fight, and the Fox Indians and some of the others were coming from the east because the British came in there and pushed them away from their homeland as they moved over. Now, part of this is my theory. That when they moved over, they were coming over, they were going to push back, so they came in and they were fighting the other Indian tribes. Not so much the Europeans, because there weren't many Europeans in there, but Chief Rowenzza said, war's never good. So he picked up the whole 1,800 village and started downriver. Took a while, but they came down and landed where we are now in 1703. So I won't go into that long story. But all right, so in 1703, and there was, but at the same time, there were a lot of, and the French had come in to Canada, Quebec especially, and formed, and they found an island up there. And very similar to ours then, because they had a main road that went right through it. La Grande Rue, every early French settlement had La Grande Rue because that's Main Street. I'm sure that's where the name that they used here in St. Genevieve before they changed everything and called it Main Street. Trying to keep it in so I don't confuse you. All right, so on this, they landed there, and it was the Jesuits, but at the same time, with all the French up there, there were 200 or 300 French trappers and traders that had come down and roamed down through this country. And so when the Jesuits came in and set up their chapel, first thing they did when they got there was say Easter Mass. And then the Indians set up their camp. But of course, there's this place for all of these trappers and traders to come in, and kind of be in a safe spot and some other people to talk to, not just where they were out in the wilderness with all that. So there was a lot of Frenchmen roaming around in there. It only took, I think in 1706, we have documented that one of the Frenchmen came in, and he was not going to be one of the trappers and traders on it. He wanted some land because early on, for 200 years and maybe more, if you owned land, if you had a piece of land, you were a well-respected citizen. You weren't just a fly-by-night or something. And this was how they rated it. Now, of course, a lot of businessmen come under that same rating, but early on, if you owned land, you were something special. So it didn't have to be a whole lot, just if anything that established you as an important person. Okay, so he came, and then they would, so as soon as, and then about a dozen more that we know came in by 1710. And so by then they organized and they drew out the plan where they had these long strips of land for everybody. And they would go from La Grande Rue, from the middle there, straight over. And each one ended up, so they had a landing place at the river. And of course, that way each one had their own land. If they had something to ship, they wanted to get to the river, they didn't have to go ask the neighbor to allow them to cross their land to get to it or bother anybody. They could go on out there. Those were the arpents, or the long lots they called them. So each one had that, and of course some of them had more than one of those put together. But that was the design, so that each one had their own port on the river. And so that's set up, but then together they built their homes. So they had a community and they were in there together and so forth. But then they would go out. And then they also had a field, which was called the common field, and they would take turns tending to that, but all the livestock was able to be out in there. And they also had to take turns to be sure if they put up any kind of fencing along there. They also took turns making sure, and heaven help them if they didn't take their turn and do it right. You know, they were well, let them know about it on there. All right. Now this, all right, I wanted to show you. Now, on this map, I showed you at the bottom where it came, that Kaskaskia River. If you follow that little trail right here, okay, then you see it shows you where this, though down close along the river in that lower part, those are all the trees and all the growths which were there until the 1900s. The Kaskaskia village, then it's right up here. And then that road, which is showing you the road from that village, and that came over to the river and tied in to along where St. Mary's is. Okay, then that road goes on up to Prairie de Rocher, and that's a bluff road. It's right along the bluff. All those quills on there, all that's the bluff. I'm just showing that. And then so it goes on up to Prairie de Rocher, and then from Prairie de Rocher you take that road out to Fort de Chartres. And then there was another Indian village up in there. So just to give you a better perspective of what it was actually a peninsula, wasn't it? We're way off from being an island yet. And you see how much, you know, it's pretty wide all the way up. Okay. And although the original site of the town of Kaskaskia is no longer visible as a town, it played an important part in history. It was established in the 1703 when the Kaskaskia Indians, migrating from their former home along the Illinois River, settled on the west bank of the river, which now bears their name. And Father Morris, Jesuit priest and superior of the missions of the Immaculate Conception, which had been designated up on the Illinois River at the Kaskaskia village by Father Marquette in 1675. So we date our church to the 1675 because that's when he declared it, which was long before Rome caught up and declared the Immaculate Conception as a special service and a special day. I think Father Marmot was there also. And they set up and they established their church. And of course, the first thing, you cut down trees, you know, and they build these upright log chapels and buildings and whatever they needed. But by 1714, they wanted to go bigger, and by then they had quite a few French come and claim arpents of land and build homes and bring wives and start families and so forth. So by 1714 they built a stone church. Now many of the early French that came in had been from the area, kind of northern France, which had a lot of stone quarries, so they knew how to do that, and they had all those bluffs. So they brought in the stone. So that was the first stone church, and I can't document it to the date like some historians of today want it, but I'm pretty sure that old hand-carved altar that we have there was put in there at that time. So it came down, and it possibly could have been done by a Lavasseur from Canada, who carved a lot of very elaborate altars for the time. This one, it could have been brought in, or maybe they worked from 1703 up to 1714 to make that altar. But I know when they built that stone church that they had a nice altar to put into it. So That's my story, and I'm sticking to that one. And nobody can. And I had the knowledgeable carpenter who was aware of all of these things, and he checked it over, trying to find out if he could find out. No, it wasn't that. He says, I can't find anything that doesn't say you're wrong. So, so that are not right on it. Okay. So all the French explorers that had been wandering around, traders, missionaries, and colonists soon came to this new settlement in numbers. And so there was a quick expansion of the military and civil power of New France into the upper Mississippi Valley. And with trade came wealth, just like today. And the town became a frontier metropolis, with comforts imported from France and not usually found on the frontier. Under the French regime, Kaskaskia became known as the Paris of the West. Really, all around there. Where are you going? That's where we're going, to Paris. Okay. All right, let's move that on up. Okay, so this was about, and I don't have a lot, about 1770, someone came along and drew this map of what he thought was the major buildings in the town. And the Jesuit complex, this is not very stable and falling, was this big lot. Let's see, you want to, I need a pointer, don't I? Go up on, now, let's see. Right, well, see where that road, the kind of a road coming off? No, on the river. Okay. By the river, see where that little indentation, no? Yeah. Right there, yeah. Okay, that, just above that, and then go up. And then the Jesuit house, and this one is not real good to show it all, but the Jesuits had a lot of, they had the whole block. Back about a block was where the church was. And they had that whole block, and they built a big complex. And of course, at that time, you didn't just have a house. If any of you have come from a farm or live on a farm or whatever, you know it's a farm. You don't just have a house. You have all these outbuildings for various things, whether it's other machinery or animals or whatever you need. And they did too. And they had a brewery, made the beer. They had a winery. Well, of course you needed wine for Mass, so they had to have a winery. But they also had a brewery, and they brewed beer. So when you see that television commercial, it says we were the first brewery in the United States. I thought, no, you weren't. So, but we have, and that's documented in some writings about the brewery. Okay, so on that. Now, things went along, they kept improving, and more wealth, more people came. This was what the guy, I think actually that was a British officer that came through, because the French and the British, you know, the many wars as they do in the Middle West, in the Mid East, I mean, now, and the French and Indian War finally ended in 1763. And so the British won, and the French were going to lose all this territory, because everything between the Appalachian and the Rocky Mountains actually was called the Illinois country because of all the Illinois tribes, the Illinois, that were in there. That was known as the Illinois country. The river wasn't dividing it for them like it does between the states. And so but France had some cousins in Spain. They were cousins. So they turned over all of the territory west of the Mississippi to cousin Spain. And so then when the British came to claim, they only got to claim what was east of the Mississippi River. So Kaskaskia was east of the Mississippi River. So they came in, but they had all kinds of trouble. The troops came to take possession of Fort Deschartres, which had become the center representing the king's office, the center of government and position. And so anyhow, they were headed for Fort Deschartres, but things weren't so friendly. But anyhow, they finally got there in 1765. By this time, all the French people, there was now French people living. Well, the village of Chartres grew up outside Fort Deschartres, and that's where the St. Anne's Church was. That developed in 1722, and that, and of course, some of the soldiers were there, married, and had families, and then people moved out there because these soldiers living at the fort, well, they couldn't do their own laundry or whatever, so there was people that moved in there that provided all these services for the military that were living in the fort. And so that village of Chartres was actually the first of it. Then there was another village up the road a ways, St. Philippe, which grew also. And if you're at the fort, instead of turning this way and going back to Prairie de Rocher, if you go on the other way, you would pass the site of St. Philippe. And there was another chapel there, which was a chapel from the St. Anne's Church. Now, St. Anne's Church became St. Joseph's Church in Prairie de Rocher, which is there today. And and all the records and everything went in there. But actually, all of those early ones date to this St. Anne's Church. So in 1765, and this is when a number of the French inhabitants migrated across the Mississippi to St. Genevieve. But that was the old village of St. Genevieve that they went into on it. But they moved away afraid because the British were not very friendly to Catholics, and all of the French were Catholics. In fact, the French king had closed off this whole territory, which he claimed, to anyone but French people. And if you were French, you were Catholic. You might not have said so, but you were. If you were in there, you were Catholic. Okay. So the British moved into Fort Deschartres, but the French people, well, there's 2 years in there, so they managed to take some of the windows out of the buildings and other things from that, so it wasn't in very good shape when the British moved into it. Well, they stayed there until 72, from 65 to 72, and it got to be too much, so they decided to move on down to Kaskaskia, which had all these people, and stores and business places and excuse me, and so forth. So they moved on down. So they moved in, and where did they go? They took over the Jesuit, this great big house that the Jesuits had, and they put in, most places had kind of a fence around it anyway. They made sure they had a big fence around, big stockade, and they called that Fort Gage after the British General Gage. And then, so the Fort Gage was in the town of Kaskaskia, and where it was now probably is in river most of the time. Not all of the village of Kaskaskia is in the river, even though that's broadcast everywhere. Somewhere between a fourth and a third of it, when the river is up, will be on area on that side. Actually, when that river changed and spread out, the big channel went over to the east, it took more off of the eastern side because a lot of land that Pierre Menard had, and he had a boathouse and a ferry there, and that's now all in the river. And of course, building all those dikes in the river and everything, hard to tell where things were and what they were.
I've got one little question here. I notice here it says Kaskaskias, but it's with a C.
Yes.
C-A-S-K-I-E-S.
And it was spelled that way for a long time.
Really?
On all the old, on the old part of it. You'll find lots of changes in spellings. That does pretty good. It's got the Kaskaskia's got an E, whereas now it's an A, but on it and K's. It could drive you crazy trying to track down all the different spellings of that and French names, as some of you who investigate any of that have learned, I'm sure. So the British were in the Jesuit because through some church politics, the Jesuits had been banned to the western side of the Mississippi, and another order could operate on the eastern side of the Mississippi. And this came out of, because this was all part of the Archdiocese of Quebec, and so he was the guy that made the decision, and it was just church politics, I can say. But the Jesuits also owned a parcel of land across the Kaskaskia River. Now that little river had lots of turns, and when it was dry, like it would have been this summer, it got down to where, there was not much at all. It could practically wade across it. And then if there would be spring rain and some snow melt, it would come up more from the rains and so forth. But so anyhow, they owned I think it was about 40 acres or something on the other side of the Kaskaskia River. So that belonged to the Jesuits. So when the British took it over and named their place Fort Gage, then people got to calling, well, that's Gage, over there. And so, let's see, did I put that other picture up there? Go up to the next one once, and we might have to come back down to that. No, that's a later picture of the town. And no, I maybe didn't put it up because it didn't show enough. But in the atlases, it'll show you. There was a lot of people, and by this time there were so many people coming into Kaskaskia that people started staying on the eastern side of the Kaskaskia River, and it was known as East Kaskaskia. And you would see that referred to in certain letters and so forth. Post office, the post office was in Kaskaskia, but into the 1800s, when the railroad came through, they also put up a station, and they called it Fort Gage because it was right there. Because by this time you had a couple streets over there and lots lining it, and just if you know where the Pierre Menard home is, it would be just to the north of the Pierre Menard home was the little village of Fort Gage. It was never incorporated and has now disappeared. But those lots were they're still marked on the county assessor's office. On it, and there was two long streets of about, it was maybe four or five blocks, and those were all residents that lived at East Kaskaskia. They were across the river. Well, this plot of land was right over there too, because it was right opposite is where the Jesuit house was. And of course they rented that out, and then by selling their crops, they had money to do their activities and live on it. And so people got calling that, and there was then later on in the 1800s, when they set up more post offices, they put a post office, and there's a picture of that in one of the atlases, where it says Fort Gage Post Office. And it was right down there by the river, right below of the Pierre Menard home. And the state railroad says it had Fort Gage on their station. So that was their stop. And so people got their mail there. And so where are you from? Well, we're from Fort Gage. Well, in their mind, after 2 or 3 generations, people tend to forget. So they thought, well, that's a fort up on the hill. That must be Fort Gage. So they start calling it Fort Gage. And then they'll look at me and say, oh, I know, because that is Fort Kaskaskia, and it's never changed. It's always been Fort Kaskaskia. It was built by Kaskaskia in the 1750s, and then when they knew the British was coming, they burned what they'd put up, because they didn't want them up there having cannons to shoot over the town. So they got rid of most of any structures and so forth on it. And then, but can't convince it, and I say, no, you don't want to call that Fort Gage. That's a British general. We got a lot of American generals. So anyhow, if you hear them call it Fort Gage, you know Fort Gage is now where the river is. It really is. And so, but just like I bet not all of you live inside St. Genevieve, or you live outside the corporate place. If you're out there, but if someone says, where are you from? You say St. Genevieve, don't you? Well, they did the same thing if they were way off in the hill where mail was delivered, or even if they had to go get it, they still would say they're from Fort Gage because that's where they got their mail. So don't fall into that trap. Now you know better. So anyhow, the British had moved down in there when George Rogers Clark came along during the American Revolution, and he crossed the river. There's a kind of a creek just above the Pierre Menard home, and the family that lived there had some boats. Now, how much of this was all set up ahead of time, they don't know exactly, but we know that the priest had a big hand in getting somebody in there. He didn't like the British, so he was all for that. And they helped take George Rogers Clark across the Kaskaskia River to come in there during the night to capture in 1778, July 4th. So, and that's why we celebrate July 4th every year, commemorating the time when he came. And then the bell, and of course the bell of Kaskaskia, we'll show you a picture of that later just in case you haven't seen it, but it's a 1741 bell. And I have school children coming along, and people coming, see this bell, and you can see it. You can almost see in their faces, oh, there's bells everywhere, why are we here? And so I have to explain to them, I said, 1741, this was the only bell in the whole valley. And you know what 911 is? Oh, yeah, they all know that. Well, this was 911. It rang, of course, for church services and 3 times a day for your Angelus, weddings, funerals, all that. But it also ran if a boat came from Europe, maybe bringing letters from old family there, or if there was anything special, if there was a fire and everybody was neat. If that bell rang, when it wasn't a church time, wasn't morning, noon, or evening, everybody knew to come in and help. So this was your 911 system. So it was very, very important. And so this one, now this one's never been recast. It's still as it came from France. They had to go down to New Orleans to pick it up. It came across the ocean. And it took them a couple years because they had mules. They wanted to make sure it wasn't going to tip over on one of the flatboats and in the river. So they tied those 2 mules along the side of the bank, and they pull it upstream, because if on the Mississippi, if you're going upstream, it's a whole different story from going downstream. And so they brought it up that way, and got it in place. And so then it's always been there, and hopefully will stay there. And very well, and we try to take care of it very well. And so, and if you want to know why we have this big celebration July 4th, come on down and see. We're glad to have everybody. All right.
Is it rung anymore? You don't ring it anymore, do you?
Well, maybe.
When no one's looking around.
They don't like it. Did develop a little bit, a kind of a crack in it, and that. So I'm told if you put enough silver in when you're casting these bronze bells, that keeps them from cracking. So I guess they didn't have quite enough, but there was always the legend that a silver crucifix had been thrown in when they were casting it. And there's a silver crucifix is shown on one side of it. The other side is 3 fleur-de-lis. That was the monogram of Louis XV, who sent the bell over. Each one of the French kings had their own monogram, but if you look closely, not all fleur-de-lis are made alike. Many different designs to them. They all have 3 points, but they are different. So that was his monogram. And then it's got the date written on it, so none of that can be disputed. Then also there's, the story of where Laclede came up and built a house at Chartres, outside Fort de Chartres, along that road close to St. Anne's, and then decided to go up and went up and scouted it out, I think, and so forth, and then that's where St. Louis started. So it actually was people from Randolph County, today's Randolph County up there, that went up to start St. Louis, and they give a 1764 date for that, and that they were probably cutting down some trees up there at that time, but it had a long ways to go before it became a village. And then the British control ended. That was the end of that. And then, let's see, we lost all that. Let's see, come back down to this other part. Okay, this is kind of was put in to show the big one, to show the rivers coming in, and showing see how the river, that's all covered in, and how it now has a big hook in it there, and it's going closer, and then the last one showing it how it came all the way through. Well, this was 150 years, but because it moved over, well, when they came in the 1800s, there were oodles of those boats up and down the river. They were all steamboats, and they needed wood, so people made a living chopping down trees and piling up the firewood they would sell to the boats as they came through so they could keep running. And then also they cut down a lot of trees to create farmland, to build their homes. And once you get all of that off of the land, it doesn't take much rain to get it. You know, any little bit then is going to take more. So it kept coming along, but as it got in the winter of 1880, and 1880, and then again 1880, 81, there was really cold winters. And because the Mississippi velocity was about 1/10 of what it is today, where it really runs fast, that ice would form, and those big blocks of ice. And as you all know, if you have a great big block of ice, it could be 80 degrees, but it doesn't do much melting, you know, maybe a little. So a big ice jam formed right where that horseshoe bend is there, right below it. So the river couldn't get through. And and then it's April, so you've got spring rains, and you've got snow melt coming down the Missouri and the Mississippi and all those rivers up north of there, just like today on it. And so so it must have been a little lower there, because then it started running over that small neck of land. They had only about 300 feet left, and it started running over. Once you take the sod off, you know, if something's not there to stop it, it's going to keep going. But then it went, but when it reached over to the Kaskaskia River, it fell 5 feet. So when they come out and say it was a giant flood caused it, I thought, if there had been a giant flood, the Kaskaskia River would have been high, as high as the other, because it would have backed up from the Mississippi. Couldn't run out, so it would have never fallen 5 feet. And then the other thing that an eyewitness put down, and he told about, you know, young people, regardless of time or space, on Sunday afternoon or sometime, they're going to get together and congregate together. Well, the group of young people wanted to visit Sunday afternoon, so they would walk out there and watch it as it was running over. And he said, oh yeah, and then every once in a while somebody say, well, we better step back here, and they'd all step back a little bit, and another hunk of land would fall off. So if it had been a big flood at that point, they wouldn't have been out there standing watching it go. So I know from that it really wasn't a big flood at that time. Now the river may have come up some after that and so forth, and then later on it did. But then when it went back down, you still had the main channel coming up past St. Mary's. That was St. Mary's Landing, and the steamboats would come. The salt from Saline was taken down to St. Mary's and loaded on. There was a Donahue's Landing right below the bend in St. Mary's, and they would come down there and load it on because they were too far out. And of course, the Saline and the River Ave, with its hundreds of miles of watershed, all run down there and come on down past St. Mary's, heading for the Mississippi. And when they couldn't get to it any sooner, now they go all the way down close to the Chester Bridge. And that's, and I've been trying to get them to dig that out, because it has silted in down there close to where that runs into the Mississippi. And so if we have big floods, that's all going to back up and not be good for St. Mary's, not good for Kaskaskia. It'll cut off our access if we have a lot of water back up there on it. So anyhow, it kept going. And for years, then it would gradually, when the river would come up, maybe it'd cut a little more and so forth. But I know I read newspapers from Chester in the 1900s that said such and such steamers coming up the river. And then they said, now let's see, we're not sure if it's going to take the right channel or the left channel. So for a long time they had two channels, you know, until it got, and then finally, and I think man helped a little bit along the ways there, till it finally changed over to where it is now. But it took many years before that happened. You still had a lot of water on both sides, and they were using both channels for a lot of activities and shipping. And I'm trying to stay in line with all this, but it's difficult. With of showing the changes there. Let's see, I'm trying to cover some of the things that seem to be not understood very well from different questions that I get. The town, in 1810, the census shows that there were 7,000 at Kaskaskia, and that was one of the largest populations that they had. And then that was when they started, became Illinois Territory, and the capital was there in 1809. And then they had enough, and there was a lot of procedure to becoming a state. But they started in on it so that in 1818, then Illinois became a state with Kaskaskia as the capital. And then that was 2 years, and then that moved on out to Vandalia, and that was, again, we had a lot of business people from the east who came in, and they really lobbied to move, well, this can't be right here, and over here, we need to go out to the middle of the state and put the capital out there. And so when they went out to where Vandalia, where Vandalia is now, there was nothing else there. And I was out there, and I was up there, and one lady that seemed to know some of their history says, yeah, they brought the wagons. It took 2 wagons to carry the documents up there. I know that. And then she said, yeah, they parked under the tree out there, that tree right out there, until they could build a building for the Capitol. So they just plotted it out on the map by using all of these map measurements, said this has to be the middle of the state, that's where it should be. But then at the same time, so before that happened, these businessmen came, and they were the ones promoting the middle of the state, and they went out and bought up a lot of this land out there, all around there. So when they went out there, so then everybody that went out there, then all the businesses and everybody that follows along with wherever your capital, your government is, and everything that's needed, they had to buy from these business people to buy their lots of land. And that's how Vandalia town was formed. But some guys got a little rich out of that on it. So that was, let's move that on up. Okay, this is, they had this, then we got up to the state, and so the one where we were shows how the town was laid out. Now, the original town was 235 acres, and then Edgar came along. He was a general from the war, but and all of those generals and everything were awarded big parcels of land for their work, and so they came in to claim that. Well, then he added some more to the original ones. No, where are we now? Oh, okay, this is the one I was looking for. On it, see all the little, see there's 4 blocks there and 2 streets. That would have been Fort Gage. See those little lots along on that, if you can see up there. And you see, it says Fort Gage. Now that's wrong. Don't cape that. That was because they were, oh, well, that's a fort. That must be Fort Gage, you know. And so, like I said, after a couple of generations, people kind of forget. And kids believe what they hear. Their first knowledge comes from at home and whatever you say. And so if you're calling it a such and such, then that's what they're going to call it. And then if they have to learn it another way, they're going to be a little leery. Wait a minute, that's not what we say. That's Mom and Dad didn't say that. Okay, that, let's see, that one that showed all the...
The bell?
No? Okay, not ready for that. That one, yeah. Okay, that shows how it was laid out, how the streets were laid out, and the one... and all the names. There's Pecan Street, and Elm Street, Charter, Independence, and so forth. And then that was, the courthouse there, Block 30 up there was where the church was. And you see the State House was right there also. And there's many stories about that State House, of who actually owned it and who rented it, and we have 3 or 4 people claiming it was their ancestors that had it, and it became the first State House. And then the courthouse, and we still have the old courthouse on the island. The church in the 1800s, you know, we're all the same through the centuries. Something better comes along, well, we better go do to that. So they got rid of those stone churches. There was a second one in 1737. and then another kind for a while. So 1838, they built this big brick church. Because by then we had people from the East coming after the war, Revolutionary War, and America now owned all this land out there. And they started coming because after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and they, something better out there, so they headed west on it. And so they built the big brick church on it, and that's the one that was taken down brick by brick. They number, if it's stone or brick, they have to number them when they want to rebuild them. So they moved it, so the church we have now is the same bricks and all of that that was brought down from Pittsburgh to build the first one, and is build the one that we use now. All right, then after the capital moved on out to Vandalia, though a lot of the businesses that had been there and were used for all of the business and so forth, and people coming in and out, moved with it. So it became more of a farming community. And it was still strongly French, as was St. Genevieve up into that time. But more and more people moved into the areas and started various other churches along the way. The Presbyterian Church was started at Kaskaskia and then moved over across the river and is now in Chester. There was one building, and it's not there anymore because of one of the floods, but it was Baptist, and Lutheran denominations used it, and Presbyterians used it, and I'm not sure that's the right order, but they all used that same building it was just outside of the incorporated area of Kaskaskia. Now, after the rivers changed and they could see, remember this was 1881, that actually, at first time it went all the way through. Somebody got busy with the legislature and they passed resolution or law, however, what they needed to do, that any locality that was in harm's way close to a river or something could move back and not lose any of their government entity, any thing. It was still, and it was incorporated. The village was incorporated in 1725 under the French. When the Americans took over, they honored all this. A lot of the measurements, the surveyors, because I know a well-known surveyor from Chester told me that La Grande Rue was a center line for all the surveys of this land along there, and they still use that same line. So they honored a lot of this that the French had set up. So anyhow, the river moved back. So they decided then, but it was actually 1891 before that got all properly channeled through the government that you could do that and still be an incorporated village. And so, but they didn't just move down to the center, they annexed a strip of land from the original village all the way down to where they are now. But by this time, many people had moved away for one reason or another. And so so what's incorporated there now is 60 acres. So when they do a census for Kaskaskia, they only count the people that are living within those 15 blocks right in the middle of the island, and all the rest of it is part of unincorporated Randolph County. So all of those people go there. So when they have signs that say 14 people, that's only the ones that are living within those 15 blocks, and all the rest of this 14,000 acres goes in with the rest of unincorporated Randolph County when they're counting on the census. People come and ask me, I said, well, they really don't do a census thing because we have so many farmers with their big sheds, which they could live in, I'm sure, and be well off. for all the very expensive machinery. And so if you count those in with the people that are living there and businesses, you'd come up with a lot different numbers than what some people use to describe it. So, but and those farmers like it that way. It's hard to, they don't want more people moving in and building. That'd take up some of their land they can farm, you know. So they're all for just keeping that farmland nice and quiet on it. And so that takes us up to, let's see, any questions here? I mean, we can go on. I've gone on long enough here, I think. But let's see, what else? Well, no, we got, what else? Where are we? Yeah, okay. And there's the bell. And that shows Pierre Menard Home and Governor Bond Monument. Governor Bond's old home is still on the island. It's a privately owned, and it was moved away from, he was just north of the original village, and that was moved over, and it's got stone, and I know I was in the basement many years ago of it, and these huge beams, you know, that they use from these big trees and everything, and we're all in that, so I know that was rebuilt from the authentic one. If you've ever been in the basement of Pierre Menard House and seen those big beams that go underneath all of the floors and everything, it's the same kind of beams that are in the basement of the Governor Bond's house, which is now on the island. William Dozo moved it over there, I think, and that's how we have Dozaville, which is a village, and it's marked that way, but it was never incorporated. Pujol School was named Pujol School because a man named Pujol lived there, and he had no family that he knew about, I guess, or descendants, and so when he died, he left his whole estate to the school district, and they used that to build those brick schools, which we had on the island. So they put Pujol on the name of that school. So people got used to saying, well, that's where they were going. You know, that was the main thing, the schools and the church. So they were going there, they were going to Pujol, which meant they were going over by the school. But it actually is outside of what is plotted as the town of Dozaville, which is just across that main road, and all those streets and blocks is Dozaville. Okay, the church, and then we have one more here, and guess who we see there?
I'm thinner.
This was when we celebrated our 300th in 03. 300 years at Kaskaskia, and now we're 321, 21, yeah, 21, heading for 22. All right. And Bishop came down and said Mass and so forth, and that's probably the last of that. But if you read all through we have another handout. I keep you busy helping me. Thank you. All right, yeah, and this will tell you a lot of that, just a brief summary of it, as well as that brochure that I gave you. If you read all through that, you should get a good idea. Any questions about any of this? What?
Yeah, the Kaskaskia manuscripts, have they all been fully transcribed?
No. Some of them has been translated. We have summaries of them to tell you what they're about, and those are in English. But there was a county clerk there at one time that translated quite a few of them, but most of them are still in French.
Where the buildings were over there, are any of those foundations still there?
Yeah, probably so. Some are. Mine still is. That was put out in the flood.
And when is the library ever open down at Chester to view those manuscripts?
Well, the manuscripts are under lock and key. And but we do have them. If you call me, if you're going to see those, you have to call me, and I can get them out and kind of show you through. We have some covers on them, because we don't let anyone handle the actual documents because they date back.
Okay, so they're not all, but I know Natalie Delphi, I mean, she's transcribed,
She,
wrote
she,
a book
yes,
and did a lot.
and that gives you a lot of information that was in there, yeah. So, any other questions? Anything? Oh yeah, Visitation Academy. That was the first girls' academy, and I'm gonna sit down here. Getting old. The Visitation Academy came in 1833. Okay, 1833. Pierre Menard and William Morrison and anyway, they wanted a school for the girls because the boys, they had, they send boys off to go to get their elaborate education, but the girls really didn't have much to go to. They get the basics, so they planned for the Visitation Sisters to come, and they came in 1833. And then and Pierre Menard contributed a lot to that, where William Morrison let them stay in his hotel there while they were building this big 5-story building. We still have visitation. People come down and visit, and they always want to visit the manor. And that was Pierre Menard's home. They called it the manor because he was their patron, that kept them, and between the two of them, they kept them fed and whatever they needed. Yeah. No, the school's not there, and they used. In fact, they used some of the. They used building material from the academy to build the rectory that's there by the church. So.
Any other questions for Ms. Lyons?
Okay. Anything else?
Again, we'd like to thank Rocher's Country Mart for sponsoring tonight's presentation. We've got another one coming up toward the end of the month. Be sure to come back. This is your museum as well, so we hope you take advantage of it.
Thank you. I need a caretaker, don't I?
Please become a member. You can stop by the gift shops on your way out and take care of it.